Okay, so phase two of the revolution, the age of Rousseau, 1792 to 1799. So we have had the National Assembly, we've had the Legislative Assembly, we've had the time of the Paris Commune, and now we are going to see yet another name change. The National Convention is going to be the form of government from 1792 to 1795. So this is a time period in which France was proclaimed a republic on September 21st, 1792. The monarchy is completely abolished, and instead republicanism is going to be installed. It will be based on the ideas of equality, liberty, and fraternity, or equalite, liberté, fraternité, so equal, freedom, and brotherhood. A majority of the members of the National Convention were Jacobins and Republicans, which were the largely well-educated middle class, or the bourgeoisie. And so we're going to see at this time that two more factions, one we've already talked about, are going to emerge in this National Convention. So the new faction is going to be called the Mountain, and it is the most radical and is comprised of radical Republicans and the urban class. Its leaders, Danton and Robespierre, sat on the uppermost left-handed benches of the Assembly Hall. So it's like a gather, so like all of the seats go up. And so they sit in the upper hand left corner, which gives, I guess, since they're sitting high up, they get called the Mountain. And then, of course, the Girondins, which we've already talked about, are more moderate than the Mountain and predominantly rule. And what's going to happen is the Girondins are going to begin to think that the Mountain is going to try to institute a dictatorship. They really start to see that they think the Mountain is too radical. But not so important as what's going on in the National Convention is an outside force outside the convention is going to have the real influence. Okay, so the sans-culottes are actually going to be and have been the influence behind the scenes. They are outside of the convention. Are going to become very influential on the National Convention. Sans-culottes means without breeches, and so they actually wore trousers instead of these new fashion breeches. They're predominantly from the working class. They are laboring poor, and they are extremely radical. They were a separate faction from those of the National Convention and had an economic agenda. Everything for them is about the economy, about money. Their violence and influence has been what's kept the revolution moving forward this whole time. They were responsible for storming the Bastille, marching on Versailles, driving the king from Tuileries, and the September massacres. And they feared the National Convention might be too moderate, even though we know how radical they really are. And the sans-culottes are going to favor direct democracy in their neighborhood clubs and assemblies, together with a mass rising or a massive uprising, if necessary, against the convention itself. And so the Mountain is actually going to join the sans-culottes to shift power from the Girondins. So they ally, so they push the more conservative, if there is a conservative in this matter, out of the National Convention, and so that they can make radical changes. But while all of this is going on, we need to turn back to the wars that France is fighting due to their tiff with Austria and Prussia, where we left off in phase one. So at this time, the revolutionary French army is actually having some victories. Prussians were stopped at the indecisive Battle of Valmy on September 20th, 1792. That was a great moral victory for the National Convention. Look, we've just been formed and we weren't beat. Then they have the Battle of Jemappes, which is the first major victory for France and results in the occupation of the entire Austrian Netherlands by November of 1792. And since they now have a victory, in February of 1793, the National Convention is going to declare war on pretty much everyone. Britain, Holland, Spain, in addition to its war with Austria and Prussia, and this is the first coalition. So one victory, and they're like, war with everyone. It is also at this time period, since they are moving on without a monarchy, since they have made themselves a republic, we are going to see Louis XVI finally convicted of treason. And he will be executed in January of 1793 by our new invention, the guillotine. The guillotine, of course, different than when we saw our kings in England being assassinated. That was with an axe. or not assassinated, I should say, being put to death, executed. But the guillotine is going to be a more humane method of killing. It's going to be quick. It's supposed to be, painless. It's you could hang someone wrong. You could not cut their head all the way off with an axe. All kinds of things. But this is supposed to be more humane, and it comes from those Enlightenment thoughts about, equality under the law. So before that, only the wealthy people got the good, humane, quick deaths, and we're going to see that everyone's going to get it with the guillotine. So the king was accused of having conspired with Austria against the revolution. Those who voted for regicide, or the killing of a king, now knew they had to preserve the government. So we have the government here with the National Convention, and especially our Girondins, and then now, of course, going to be our Mountain and our Sans-Culottes, knowing they have put the king to death. If they don't preserve this government and royalists return to power, we are going to see that they would lose their lives, of course, because, they killed the king. The Republic's military fortunes were in a state of crisis, however, by the spring of 1793. So this is where we're going to pick up. In May of 1793, but before that, we need to also know that Marie Antoinette, October 16th, 1793, is executed, and so she will follow after Louis, also convicted of treason. So in May of 1793, the Mountain, who are sympathetic to the Sans-Culottes, the Jacobins, supported by the Sans-Culottes, are going to oust the Girondins. So now it's the Jacobins with the Mountain and the Sans-Culottes here on one side, going to oust the Girondins. The Mountain had believed that the Girondins would ally with conservatives and royalists and try to take back power or overthrow this revolution. Robespierre is really going to be our organizing force, and he is going to organize what are called the enragés, which are the radical working class leaders of Paris. They are going to seize and arrest 31 Girondist members of the National Convention, which leaves the Mountain in control. So with the Girondists not being in session in the National Convention, then the Mountain doesn't have anyone to vote against them, and they are even more radical than the Sans-Culottes. The revolutionary government had finally lost the confidence of much of France. This is where it gets all crazy, and people are like, woo, this is not where we thought it was going, this is not what we wanted. Many Girondins are going to flee Paris and work against the revolution. Marat, who was also one of our leaders of this time period, is going to be stabbed by Charlotte Corday. She is a perfect example of women's resistance to this form of revolution, their distaste for it. She was a supporter of the Girondist faction, and she told Marat she had names. He was taking names of anti-revolutionaries to have him guillotined. And so she brings a list. He has a skin condition, so he is in his bath because he can't find comfort elsewhere. And while he is scribing down this list, she stabs him in the bath. And he, under this painting by Jacques-Louis David, is going to be immortalized. David is going to immortalize him as some kind of martyr. He's a neoclassical painter. We'll see him again with Napoleon. It's called The Death of Marat. But he is going to see him as this, amazing revolutionary figure that struck down and paint Corday as the bad person, whereas most people in France would have sided with her if things were out of control. Marat and, being suspicious of all of these people was not the way the revolution needed to go. But now, because of this assassination of Marat, we're going to see that the Mountain, the Sans-Culottes, this group becomes even more scared and want to get rid of any people against the revolution. And this time period will be called the Committee of Public Safety. So we've had the National Convention. Now we will have the Committee of Public Safety, 1793 to 1794. So by the summer of 1793, the Committee of Public Safety is going to become an emergency government. So they declare this a time of emergency, and its task is to deal with the internal and external challenges to the revolution. So internal being the counter-revolutionaries or people against the revolution, external being the wars they are involved in. And it is made up by 12 people. So essentially, these 12 people equal a dictatorship in France at this time. It is led by Maximilien Robespierre. He's our head guy here of the Committee of Public Safety. He is heavily influenced by the ideas of Rousseau and fanatically supported revolutionary idealism and the idea of general will. He is going to take that and manipulate it to say, we 12 know what is good for everyone. That is the general will. Louis Saint-Just was also a major leader along Robespierre in this action of the Committee of Public Safety. And the committee is going to closely collaborate with the sans-culottes, or our working poor. So we're going to see the working poor favored in all of their actions during this phase of the revolution. So one of the first laws that they are going to give is the law of maximum, and this is not what you think it'd be. You'd think with Enlightenment ideals in the Revolution we would see a lot of laissez-faire, but the Committee of Public Safety is going to say this is a time of emergency, so we need a planned, controlled economy to respond to these food shortages and related economic problems so we can enable France to urge total war against its external enemies. This is a time of war, a time of chaos, a time of emergency, and so the government should be in complete control of the economy. The government decreed maximum allowable prices fixed in paper assignats for key products. The price of bread was fixed at levels poor could afford. Rationing was introduced to make sure bread was shared fairly. They get rid of white bread altogether and make what is known as the bread of equality, or the blending of the flours altogether, so there's no longer a brown bread for the poor and a white bread for the rich. The government is going to nationalize many small workshops and requisition raw materials and grain from peasants. Arms and munitions produced for war effort. And in effect, as we're going to see this in second semester, it was an early version of socialism. So we're seeing a very early version of socialism used in time of emergency to take control of the economy by the state. We will also see, however, slavery being abolished in the French colonies, Enlightenment there, Santo Domingo, and Haiti. Okay, so besides economy, we're going to see that the French revolutionaries are going to become successful militarily as well. Lazare Carnot is going to reorganize the French army. Levée en masse is put in place under Carnot, where the entire nation was conscripted into service as war was defined as a national mission, so forced conscription into service. The size of the army then will grow to 1 million men, which is unprecedented in history of European warfare. They matched every person they're fighting 4-1. They became an awesome fighting machine, a military machine of steel, fervor, and blood. They may have not had all the ammunitions, but they were, there were so many of them that run in with bayonets and fervor and steel, and there's more behind them if they should be struck down. So by July 1794, Austria, Netherlands, and the Rhineland, which is along the border of France and Germany today, were once again controlled by France. The first coalition, or everyone that was fighting against France, was falling apart. The planned economy made mobilization effective, so their planned economy is working. Nationalism is going to become a strong force uniting French people, and these victories will lead to relaxation of emergency controls, but the reign of terror will be extended because now the committee is going to institute this terror against any counter-revolutionaries. And this is probably the most notorious and the most thing you're most familiar with event of the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, 1793 to 1794. So the Reign of Terror is what most people think about when they think about the French Revolution, putting that guillotine to work. The law of suspects is going to be put into place just like we had the law of maximum. Law of suspects is going to say that any alleged enemies of the revolution or state needed to be brought before revolutionary tribunals that were created to hear cases of treason. So it is going to become a political weapon, this law of suspects. It was instituted as an alternative to the lynch law of the September massacres, and it's at the same time period, although we've already talked about this, that Louis XVI was convicted of treason and executed on January 21st, 1793, and Queen Marie Antoinette executed later in the year, of course, for being anti-revolutionaries. But about 40,000 people throughout France are going to be executed or die in prison, many by the guillotine. Executions are going to become a spectator sport at this time. So people outside of France start to think the French are pretty crazy. They start to say, the French killed their king to get a dictatorship and all of this chaos, anarchy, death, and destruction that Burke had prophesied. The terror, like I said, is going to become a political weapon, but it's not directed at any class in particular. There's little spies everywhere, and so all kinds of people are being executed. 8% were nobles, 14% were bourgeoisie, mainly from rebellious southern cities, 6% were clergy, 70% were peasant and laboring class. Most deaths are going to occur in places in open revolt against the National Convention, such as Vendée in western France. Another 300,000 people will be imprisoned on top of the 40,000 that are killed. And eventually, really, no one can feel safe from Robespierre's reign of terror, as even leading Jacobins who opposed Robespierre, like even asked a question about what he was doing, were eventually executed. Girondists who will be executed in September of 1793. So the Girondists have been kicked out of the National Convention, including Charlotte Corday, who had assassinated Marat. So you have what they would consider the anti-revolutionaries, even though they were revolutionaries. The Girondists kind of, propelled all of this along. But then you have people who were executed for being too revolutionary. Jacques Hébert was a radical social democrat who led the Angry Men. The Hébertists were his followers, and they were a party of extreme terror. You'd think they'd be right up Robespierre's alley. But he will have their leaders executed in March of 1794 for being responsible for deaths of 2,000 people at Nantes, where they were loaded onto barges and deliberately drowned. And so they were executed for being too zealous with their revolution. So you have it coming at all sides. Danton and his followers are even going to be executed in April of 1794 for what Robespierre would say was being too lenient on anti-revolutionaries, like imprisoning them instead of executing them. Okay, so we have this reign of terror, we have all these people being executed, and then Robespierre is going to create what is known as the Republic of Virtue, and it will emerge as a new political culture under Robespierre to inculcate revolutionary virtue, which means he's trying to get people actively involved in the government, to make everything about the revolution, to shut down the churches, and out of this is the cult of supreme being introduced in June of 1794, and instead of the churches of France, it's going to be a deistic natural religion in which the republic was declared to recognize the existence of God and the immortality of the soul. But remember deism, organized religion, and that the clockmaker and all of that. Notre Dame Cathedral will be converted into a temple of reason. Catholics, as you can guess, were now firmly against the convention, basically because Robespierre is de-Christianizing France. He even replaces the old Gregorian calendar with a new Republican calendar where the months are named like snowy, windy, flower, to eliminate anything from the old order and make everything the new order. Robespierre is quoted for saying, "Virtue and terror must be had during a revolution. You can't have one without the other." So he definitely terror and what he thinks is revolutionary virtue. So the end of the terror, because you can only guess this can only go so far, is going to be the Thermidorian reaction, because opposition to Robespierre mounts in July of 1794, but we don't have that calendar anymore, so it would be the 9th day of Thermidor, which is how it gets its name. So it was at this time that some followers of the Enlightenment who were influenced by the ideas of Voltaire are going to help bring about Robespierre's downfall, because they're pretty much afraid everyone's going. Anyone could be next on that guillotine. So July 27, 1794, Robespierre was denounced in the convention, arrested. I think they called him there saying they had a list of other counter-revolutionaries' names, and then end up arresting him there, and executed the next day along with his close associates. After the death of Danton, many in the National Assembly had feared they might be next. So it's really Danton's assassination who had been really close with Robespierre. The other people were like, ooh, it could be any of us on his list next. The working class radicals now no longer supported him after the deaths of Hébert. Remember, really, he'd even taken out really radical revolutionaries and other left-wing radicals. So the Thermidorian reaction of 1794 is going to end the reign of terror and constitute a significant swing to the right or conservatism. Respectable bourgeoisie, middle-class lawyers and professionals who had begun this whole revolution, if you remember way back at the beginning, the Third Estate, the Tennis Court Oath of 1789, are going to reassert their authority. So we're going to start to see that the laws are going to again start benefiting the middle class rather than these sans-culottes. Reduced powers, the powers of the Committee of the Public Safety are going to be reduced, the Jacobin Club is going to be closed, and Girondins will be readmitted to the government. And this brings about our next time period called the Directory of 1795 to 1799. And so, yes, a name change to the government again. We now have the Directory 1795 to 1799. So a new constitution is written in 1795, which set up a republican form of government. A new assembly chose a 5-member executive branch to govern France, which was called the Directory, a bicameral legislature, so two houses. The executive branch was the Directory, as I said, made up of 5 directors. So you're seeing here that Montesquieu-esque branches of government. Almost all adult males were able to vote, but they only voted for electors, and office holding was reserved to property owners. They're going to start to rely pretty quickly, the Directory, on the military to keep royalists and Jacobins at bay, to keep their enemies at bay. And once again, just like we had at the beginning of the revolution where we started in phase 1, the middle class now controls the government. The middle class actually controlling the government is going to become the Directory's major weakness, as its support came from a narrow band of French society. So this little middle class is going to have more opponents than it does followers. All economic controls that had been formed were removed, which ended the influence of the sans-culottes. More paper money was printed. It allowed prices to rise sharply, where we had that control with the law of maximum under the sans-culottes. We're going to see that the middle class is going to seek peace in order to gain more wealth and to establish a society where money and property determined prestige and power, where the sans-culottes had taken control of the economy. So this is a bourgeoisie, male-dominated government. The Directory in 1795 will also disband women's workshops and urge women to tend to their homes, because it is a male bourgeoisie dominated government. So challenges to the Directory is going to be that as a small middle class, you are going to be attacked from both sides. And so in October of 1795, the aristocracy is going to attempt a royalist uprising against the Directory. A rebellion will be put down with the help of Napoleon Bonaparte, who happened to be in Paris at the time, which we were going to talk about in much detail on Thursday. Thus, the constitutional republic is going to make itself dependent on military protection at the outset. Because it is having attacks from both sides, because it has a narrow band of followers, the Directory is going to be very dependent on the military, which is going to lead to the role and the rise of Napoleon that we're going to talk about later. So the sans-culottes repeatedly criticized the government and its economic policies, so our last holders of government, but they did not have the influence to force change because of all of the reign of terror. So the Conspiracy of Equals, led by Gracchus Babeuf, is going to be formed to overthrow the Directory and replace it with a dictatorial democratic government, which would abolish private property and enforce equality. This is regarded as a precursor to modern communism, and the Directory is actually going to repress the Conspiracy of Equals without difficulty and guillotine Babeuf. So this first attempt, not going to work. We're going to see, as you saw the slide, change the end of the Directory in a minute. Spoiler alert, but we have a couple more things to talk about. So because they got rid of the economic reforms, the sans-culottes, growing inflation and mass public dissatisfaction mounted, but was ignored by the Directory. The government was bankrupt, corrupt, and unwilling to control inflation that severely hurt the impoverished masses of French peasants. So there are elections in April of 1797, right in all of this dissatisfaction, and because of this, in the narrow band of followers, the middle class is not going to win. The royalists will actually have a victory in this election, but the results are going to be annulled by the Directory. So what the Directory is basically showing, they are a dictatorship. The idea of maintaining the republic as a free or constitutional government at this point was abandoned. The only reason, with all of these problems, that the Directory was able to stay in power were the military successes and its military support. that will allow it to remain in power until 1799. The first coalition that the French had been fighting was effectively defeated by 1797, and they had isolated England and removed its army from the continent. France had defeated the English armies in Egypt at the Battle of the Pyramids in 1798. Although Napoleon will later have his navy destroyed by England's Lord Horatio Nelson in the Battle of the Nile, which we're going to talk about in 1798. But the end of the Directory, even with the military support and the military victories, is going to be caused by a military conspiracy. Is going to emerge to save the revolution and prevent a royalist return to power, because as we know in the last election, the royalists have more supporters. So Abbey Sieyes, so you remember he wrote What is the Third Estate? We are everything. What have we been treated like? Nothing. What do we want? Something. So he becomes the leader of this conspiracy, and he's actually going to invite Napoleon to join conspirators and overthrow the Directory. And Napoleon will do so upon returning from Egypt with his forces. The coup d'etat, Brumaire, November 1799. So when Napoleon returns from Egypt with his forces, he will drive legislators from the Legislative Assembly, and a new constitution will establish the beginning of the consulate era, with Napoleon as consul, which is an old Roman government term. And the plebiscite, or general referendum or vote, was overwhelmingly approved. 3,000,000 to 1,562. Napoleon wins, and this sets us up for our discussion of Napoleon and our final phase of the French, some would say French Revolution, or the era of Napoleon on Thursday.